Hi everyone, it's Fool's Errand, and I'm back again with the first of hopefully many episodes in my new podcast series. The goal of this series is to talk about several topics that I've been really wanting to talk about, but not really spend all the time I usually spend writing a script or editing a video. So with that preamble out of the way, let's talk about what I think should be the first topic of this series, and that is power in gaming and fiction in general. Now, what do I mean when I talk about power? Well, when most people talk about power, they're talking about firepower, raw brute force, the ability to just overwhelm your obstacles until they are gone. And technically, that is a correct use of the term power. It isn't, but it doesn't cover everything. So, if you look up the definition to the word power, it speaks of the ability to do or act, the ability to accomplish a task. And I feel like that's important to keep in mind because it implies that power is subjective to the task in which the power is being applied to. And this plays in very well to fiction and gaming because thematically you can have a character that's shown to be very strong and still completely incapable of beating a task, and the implication is that they aren't powerful despite the fact that they clearly are. Conversely, you could have a character that is not powerful at all, but he's still capable of completing a task, and there's an inherent implication that there is a power beyond just their physical ability to complete the task despite all odds. And that plays into things like theme and difficulty. A game that plays off the theme of a character that is generally weak but can still complete his tasks would be, say, Amnesia or Bendy and the Ink Machine. Games where you have this impossible enemy that you literally cannot surmount. You can't deal damage. But conversely, you can still complete your task because the task isn't actually to defeat that enemy, it's to simply escape them. So that would be a situation where the character is implied to be weak, but still has a general power to complete his task beyond what is directly in front of him. Another example would be, say, Dark Souls. Dark Souls would be an interesting one and plays into a larger topic of power progression, and I'll get to that in a second. But that is also a game in which you are starting off as generally weak versus the enemies you're coming up against. But as you progress, you get better at the game. The character itself becomes stronger. He gets better equipment. Suddenly, what used to be relatively hard tasks become relatively minor tasks because your character has become more powerful as the game progressed. And that's an interesting topic, the idea of player skill playing into power, because that is a thing a lot of games don't really consider. Like when they design their power progression, they strictly design it in the mechanics of the game, but they strip out the player perspective. They don't really put into account the idea that the player himself might be getting better at the game at a rate faster than what is originally expected, which can lead to a player that is much more powerful than was originally expected because of how quickly they personally progressed in skill level, which in turn increases their in-game power. Of course, there are several other subjects. Are easy games inherently bad? And other such topics. Now, I guess before I should get into that, I should probably explain I don't think hard games should be made easier. Hard games have their place. I've played Cuphead. I've played some Dark Souls. I didn't really have enough time to finish it. I really should. It's such a great game. But these games are meant to be difficult. Their power dynamic is built into the theme of the game, and you can't really change that without changing the very theme of the game. But conversely, that doesn't mean that easy games are inherently bad either. Those games exist, but you should notice that when you play a game where you are inherently easy, or in which your power in the game is obscenely larger starting off than, say, a Dark Souls or a Cuphead. Well, in these games, you should notice that they tend to have really short play times, and that's kind of a point, isn't it? That when a game is easy, it's really more of a one-off. I've never really seen a game that was inherently easy on the offset that had any real staying power. Like, they were usually just pickup games that you played for like 4 hours of like screwing around, doing nothing, and then you put it down and you forgot that you ever played it. Like, outside of gaming and say like tabletop gaming, you can see that a lot. When you play like D&D and people make characters that are extremely overpowered, those characters are usually never meant for any prolonged campaign, and they probably know that on the onset. Because if they did, they would probably want to make a character that they could actually invest in. And that's kind of the point. When if the character's already powerful, there is no way to progress power. And if there's no way to progress in power, be that skill level or in the game itself, there's no way to actually invest yourself in the growth of the character. That isn't to say that it can't happen. Outside of gaming, an example would be like One Punch Man, a story about a dude whose power level is literally at its peak and nothing can overwhelm his power because of how powerful he is. But at the same time, he's not the focus of the story. He's actually more of a secondary character despite him being the main character, if that makes any sense. Because the story follows the characters that are around him, who are all much less powerful, and their power is lessened by being in proximity to his. But back to gaming. So, I've talked about the idea of power progression and how power progression helps with investment in the game. I've talked about how power can play into the theme of the game, and how games that have their power level implicitly written into the game's theme have a hard time changing it. I could talk a little more about personal skill level. I think a good example that came out recently that talks about skill level of the player as power would be, say, Doom Eternal. If you will go into any Doom Eternal forum, there's always an argument about, say, the Marauder. Now, the Marauder is not a hard enemy. I've made a review about it. I did probably complain about it a little more than intentional, because I had accidentally had my view colored a little bit before I had made the review. But looking back, the Marauder was not a hard enemy. He didn't really slow me down. And now there's known tactics that easily defeat him every single time. There really isn't an issue with the character. But to this day, people argue that the Marauder's too hard, or that he affects the theme. Now, arguments could be made about how he affects the theme, but for the most part, they tend to put him in decent locations, even if several times he does tend to randomly show up, and there's no real pomp or circumstance to his appearance. Despite the fact that he's supposed to be like an important character. But other than that, like in terms of power, this is where skill level comes in. The Marauder is a character that, if you have any decent grasp of the mechanics of the game, he becomes a fairly easy enemy to beat. I usually beat him using explosives. he blocks everything from the front, so my general thought was, oh, well, then I'll just attack him from behind, and I would use explosives behind him to stagger him and attack him from the front. But that was my method. The intended method was to just attack him whenever he was about to melee you, which is what most people tend to use. The more common strategy would be, say, the super shotgun ballista quick switch technique. Like, all of these inherent methods imply that that once you learn them, you become more powerful against the Marauder, who at first, when you first met him, you didn't know anything about him, you had no skill in fighting him. When you first met him, he was more powerful than you. He was a much harder enemy to beat, and in fact, that plays in well to the fact that he shows up as basically a boss, because when you first meet him, you never met him, you don't know his mechanics, no one had really knew how to fight him yet. He was more powerful than you because you didn't have any skill in fighting him. But then as you progressed in the game, you got used to the mechanics, you had a better grip of how to fight enemies, you got an understanding of how to fight him, and he became an easier task to surmount, and by definition, the ease in which you can complete a task implies an inherent growth in power. But anyway, I don't really think I have anything more to talk about on this topic. If you managed to get this far, which, thank you so much for doing that. I understand that this was kind of a rambling mess. I've really been meaning to get this topic off my chest for a while. And I thank you so much for putting up with my nonsense. If you aren't subscribed, please subscribe. If you like this video, please like. Please share the video if you want. If you feel like referencing this video, feel free to message me about it. Well, anyway, this has been Fool's Errand, and I'm off. See ya.